There is a particular kind of weight that comes with a famous surname, and it is not the weight most people imagine from the outside. From the outside, it looks like an advantage. Doors open faster, names travel further. Introductions carry context that other people spend years trying to build from scratch. But the weight works in the opposite direction too, and it presses down hardest on the people who want to build something genuine rather than simply inherit the association. For nearly 3 decades, one member of the Jackson family understood that weight better than almost anyone alive. He carried it quietly, made choices that kept him largely out of the public conversation, and waited for a moment that most people in his position would have tried to force years earlier. When Jaafar Jackson was announced as the actor who would portray his uncle Michael Jackson in one of the most anticipated biopics in Hollywood history, the reaction was predictable. Skeptics immediately questioned whether the casting was about bloodline rather than ability, while supporters pointed to the family resemblance and assumed the role had essentially found its actor on its own. Both responses missed the more interesting story, which was what happened in the roughly 2 years between that announcement and the moment the film reached screens. What Jaafar did during that period was not simply prepare for a role, he rebuilt himself from the ground up as a performer, learning an entirely new craft, under conditions that gave him almost no margin for error. The results produced the highest-grossing music biopic in box office history, and turned an artist most people had never heard of into one of the most talked-about new presences in film. Before we get into how that transformation actually happened, here is a question worth sitting with from the beginning. What would you have done if you were in his position? The most famous entertainer in history was your uncle. You grew up in a household where that name meant something so enormous it had its own gravitational field. Would you have spent your career trying to step out of that shadow, or would you have found a way to walk directly through it? The answer Jaafar chose determined everything that followed. Who Jaafar Jackson actually was, before the role. Jaafar Jeremiah Jackson was born in Los Angeles in the summer of 1996, the son of Jermaine Jackson, one of the original members of the Jackson 5, and Alejandra Genevieve Oaziaza, who was born in Bogota, Colombia. He grew up as one of 11 siblings in a family where the Jackson name carried the weight of one of the most documented musical dynasties in American entertainment history. He was raised in a Muslim household, a fact that shaped his upbringing in ways that set him apart from some of his relatives' more publicly visible lives. In 2020, he traveled to Saudi Arabia to perform Umrah, sharing documentation of that experience with his followers online. The gesture was characteristic of someone who had built a quieter public presence than most people with his surname. Unlike the pattern that defines many children of famous families, Jaafar mostly avoided manufacturing early headlines. He appeared on a family reality series in the mid-2010s, which gave him brief visibility, but he used that platform primarily as a stepping stone rather than a destination. The more deliberate choice was to step back from that kind of exposure and concentrate on developing something he could genuinely call his own. That something was music. In 2019, he released his debut single, a soul and R&B track that demonstrated vocal ability, rooted in his family's musical tradition, without attempting to replicate any single predecessor. He continued releasing material in that vein throughout the years that followed, building a catalog grounded in craft rather than trend-chasing. None of the releases generated mainstream momentum, but that seemed secondary to the objective. Each project functioned as a training exercise for an artist working through the process of finding his own voice rather than borrowing someone else's. The decision to pursue music quietly for years before any film career materialized was, in retrospect, the first indication of the discipline that would define his approach to the far larger challenge ahead. Jaafar's version of patience turned out to be the foundation for everything that came after, the casting decision and the skepticism it produced. In January 2023, Lionsgate announced that Jaafar Jackson would portray Michael Jackson in a biographical film directed by Antoine Fuqua, the filmmaker responsible for Training Day and The Equalizer. The news moved fast across entertainment media, and the commentary that followed it split along lines that were entirely predictable. The skeptics argued that nepotism had done the work here, that a performer with a modest musical discography and no acting credits had been handed the most scrutinized biographical role of the decade because of his last name and his facial resemblance to the subject. It was a reasonable concern on its face, and it reflected a broader pattern of concern about how Hollywood makes these kinds of decisions. What the skeptics did not have access to at the time was the full casting process. Reports that emerged later indicated that nearly 2,000 actors had been considered for the part before Jaafar was selected. He did not walk in and claim the role through inheritance. He went through auditions and screen tests like any other candidate and was ultimately chosen in a competitive process that by every available account evaluated his actual capabilities against the specific demands of the role. His grandmother, Jaafar Jackson, publicly endorsed the casting in terms that went beyond family loyalty. She said he embodied her son and that watching him step into the role carried genuine emotional weight for her. That statement came from someone who had spent decades watching her youngest child become one of the most imitated performers in history. Her assessment carried a particular kind of authority. The question of whether skepticism is a fair response when a family member takes on a role like this has no clean answer. The casting created both an opportunity and an obligation simultaneously. The resemblance and the family knowledge gave Jaafar access to material and understanding that no outside actor could replicate. The famous name guaranteed that any shortcoming would be amplified far beyond what a first-time film actor would normally face. Whether that trade was worth it would only become clear once the film existed. Think about what it means to walk into an audition room carrying the name of the person you are auditioning to play. Every person in that room already has a detailed and emotionally loaded picture of exactly how your subject moved, spoke, laughed, and performed. That is not a normal audition. That is a category of pressure most actors will never experience. 2 years of rebuilding. The preparation nobody saw. From the moment the casting was confirmed to the moment filming began, Jaafar entered what can only be accurately described as a multi-year dismantling and reconstruction of himself as a performer. The starting point was acting itself, because he had never done it professionally before. Unlike many performers who transition from music to film with some prior experience in smaller productions, Jaafar came to this role with essentially no acting background. His first task was to find a coach and build a craft from the foundation. That process reportedly involved techniques drawn from serious theatrical training rather than the accelerated preparation typical of a commercial film production. He spent significant time at the former Jackson family estate in Encino, California, immersing himself in the physical environment where Michael Jackson had grown from a child performer into a global phenomenon. The intention was not to study a location, but to absorb something less tangible, the context in which a specific kind of artistic development had occurred. That approach reflects a more sophisticated understanding of character preparation than simply drilling choreography in a rehearsal studio. The vocal work ran alongside the movement training. Jaafar worked with coaches to match not only the pitch and tone of his uncle's speaking voice, but the specific rhythms of Michael's speech patterns, the places where he would slow down or soften, the particular register he used in interviews versus performance settings. He studied archival interview footage at reduced playback speed to catch mannerisms so subtle that a viewer watching at normal speed would register them unconsciously without ever being able to identify them specifically. Table readings with the full cast under Fuqua's direction were described by participants as resembling serious theater workshops rather than conventional film rehearsals. Fuqua's approach created an environment in which the emotional logic of each scene was interrogated before a single camera was positioned. The most technically demanding single element of the entire preparation was the moonwalk, a movement so universally recognized that even a performance that achieves 95% accuracy reads as wrong to an audience that grew up watching the original. Jaafar reportedly broke the motion down to its component mechanical elements, studying the precise weight distribution and timing that distinguishes the genuine version from every imitation that has ever existed, and practiced the sequence until it stopped looking like something he was executing and started looking like something that was simply part of how he moved. If you have ever tried to learn a physical skill by studying video footage, you already have some understanding of how different that process feels from watching the skill performed by someone who has internalized it. Now multiply that gap by the knowledge that every error will be captured on film and compared frame by frame against decades of original footage by millions of people who have those movements memorized. That is the environment in which Jaafar was working through this. The physical transformation. The camera documented alongside the behavioral and movement preparation came the work of constructing the physical appearance that would make the performance visually credible. Academy Award-winning makeup designer Bill Corso led the transformation process, working with prosthetics and styling built around Jaafar's own facial structure rather than using extreme alteration to mask it. The family resemblance between Jaafar and his uncle was a practical asset here. The team reportedly needed considerably less prosthetic intervention than this kind of work typically requires, because the underlying structural similarities between the two faces allowed the makeup to function as refinement rather than reconstruction. Getting into character each shooting day involved hours in the makeup chair before a single scene was filmed. The process was reportedly so complete that crew members who encountered Jaafar on set for the first time after the full look was assembled described a moment of genuine disorientation. The visual result landed in a space that did not read as costume but as something more unsettling to people who had grown up with footage of Michael Jackson. An inexplicable familiarity that the rational mind could not immediately process. When early production stills circulated online, the response from longtime fans divided along predictable lines, but with one consistent element across the positive reactions: the comment that the resemblance had to be seen to be believed. That kind of response is meaningful for a different reason than it might initially appear. It does not just indicate good makeup work. It indicates that the physical transformation and the behavioral preparation had aligned closely enough that the two were amplifying each other rather than existing as separate effects. The complications that reshaped the film. The path from casting announcement to finished film was not straightforward. Early versions of the screenplay reportedly included material addressing the child's sexual abuse allegations made against Michael Jackson during his later career, including a dramatized sequence depicting the 1993 police raid on the Neverland Ranch. That material was ultimately removed from the production, partly because of legal restrictions tied to a settlement with one of the accusers that prohibits their depiction in film or television. The absence of that material substantially changed the shape of the story the finished film tells. The production went through significant reshoots in the middle of 2025, adding tens of millions of dollars to a budget that had already reached approximately $200 million, funded jointly by Lionsgate, Universal Pictures, and the Jackson estate. The reshoot process extended the production timeline considerably and rerouted several narrative threads. The finished film concentrates on Michael Jackson's rise through the Jackson 5 and the early years of his solo career, closing around the period of the Bad World Tour in 1988, rather than tracing the full arc of his life and the controversies that defined its later chapters. That decision drew divided critical responses. Reviews consistently noted that the film was visually accomplished and that Jaafar's performance was more persuasive than many critics had anticipated. The objection that appeared most frequently was the absence of the more complicated material, with several critics characterizing the result as an account that illuminates certain parts of the subject's life, while deliberately leaving others in shadow. The film holds a critical score in the high 30s on major review aggregators, which places it firmly in the territory of audience appreciation outpacing critical consensus. That gap is itself an interesting data point. Here is the question that division raises. Can a biographical film be considered a genuine portrait of a person's life if it leaves out the most contested chapters of that life? Is narrative selection always a form of bias, or is it simply the inherent condition of any biographical work that covers decades in 2 hours? There is no clean answer, but it is worth forming your own view before a sequel that reportedly covers the later period arrives. The trailer that broke a record before the film existed. The first indication of how large the film's potential audience had grown came before a single paying viewer had seen a finished cut. When Lionsgate released the initial teaser trailer in November 2025, built around a sequence of Michael Jackson's most recognized recordings, it reportedly accumulated more than 30 million views within the first 6 hours of release and surpassed 116 million views within its first full day online. Those numbers made it the largest trailer debut in Lionsgate's history and reportedly surpassed every previous trailer launch for a music biopic or concert film, including the marketing rollout for a major Taylor Swift concert film that had itself set a high watermark for the genre not long before. Numbers at that scale mean something beyond simple marketing enthusiasm. For a film whose entire commercial proposition rested on a single performer's ability to carry an enormous legacy, Trailer viewership of that magnitude signaled that the pressure had shifted completely from private preparation rooms into full public view. Every frame of Jaafar that appeared in the teaser was immediately captured, slowed down, and placed alongside archival Michael Jackson footage for frame-by-frame comparison by an online audience that had the original footage memorized. The comparison exercise produced a consistent reaction among the most skeptical segment of that audience, reluctant acknowledgement that something in what they were watching was more persuasive than they had expected. That shift in the skeptical response was arguably the most significant thing the trailer accomplished, because it moved the conversation from whether the performance was legitimate to how legitimate it actually was. Would you have watched that trailer with the expectation of being convinced, or with the expectation of finding fault? The answer probably depends on how you came to it, and both responses are understandable. What happened when the film opened is a different question entirely. The box office result and what it means. Michael premiered in Berlin in April 2026, before opening in IMAX theaters across North America on April 24th. The opening weekend delivered approximately $97 million domestically and around $217 million worldwide, breaking the previous opening record for a music biopic that had been established roughly a decade earlier. The film kept building from there. Within weeks of release, it had surpassed the total domestic gross of Bohemian Rhapsody, the Freddie Mercury biopic that had long been considered the commercial benchmark for the biographical music film genre. As it expanded into additional international markets through the summer months, including a separate release window in Japan, it crossed the worldwide total of Bohemian Rhapsody to become the highest-grossing music biopic ever made. Then it surpassed Oppenheimer's total gross to become the highest-grossing biopic centered on a real individual in box office history. With a combined worldwide total approaching $1 billion, it also became the single highest-grossing release in Lionsgate's history, ahead of franchise titles the studio had relied on for more than a decade. Given the critical reception those numbers arrived alongside, the commercial performance requires some examination. A film with a Rotten Tomatoes score in the high 30s, generating $1 billion in revenue, represents an unusual combination. The most straightforward explanation is that a substantial portion of the audience for this film was not primarily seeking critical approval for the artistic choices made in the screenplay. They were seeking the experience of watching someone credible inhabit the physical presence of a performer they had grown up watching, accompanied by the music that had defined those experiences. On those specific terms, the film delivered what its audience came for. The more interesting question might be this: does the commercial result tell us something meaningful about the audience's relationship with Michael Jackson's legacy at this specific moment in time, more than 15 years after his death? That a film covering only the first chapter of his public life, leaving out the most contested material, could generate this level of response says something about how the cultural memory of that particular figure operates. What do you think it says? The comment section is the right place for that conversation. The person behind the performance, away from the production, Jaafar has spent nearly a decade in a relationship with singer Maddie Simpson, whom he began dating in 2016. The two made their relationship public 2 years later at a musical event honoring producer Quincy Jones, and remained together through the full arc of the film's development and release. Reports indicate the couple became engaged in early 2025 during what was described as a private proposal involving a distinctive yellow diamond ring, followed by a small celebration with close family. Simpson, who has her own background in soul and R&B, appeared alongside Jaafar at premieres in Berlin, Los Angeles, and Gary, Indiana throughout the film's global rollout. The consistency of her presence across what was an extended and demanding public period reflected something about the personal stability that supported what was, by any measure, an extraordinarily high-pressure professional undertaking. During the press tour, Jaafar became progressively more open about the preparation methods that had defined the 2 years between casting and filming. He described drawing from his uncle's personal writings, including handwritten notebooks, private reflections, and daily affirmations, material that gave him access to Michael's internal reasoning that no amount of choreographic study could have provided. He spoke about the gap between imitation and understanding, and about how the work of crossing that gap had occupied most of the preparation period. In separate public appearances, he reflected on the experience of learning to act formally for the first time in his life, after accepting a role that demanded the most demanding kind of performance. Not fictional character construction, but a credible rendering of a real human being whose physical presence millions of people have an intimate memory of. That learning process, he acknowledged, happened largely off-camera, in the accumulation of small decisions made in coaching sessions, archival study, and the quiet hours between rehearsals where the material either becomes part of you or reveals that it has not yet done so. What comes next, and what this story actually tells us. Following the film's commercial performance, Lionsgate confirmed in May 2026 that a sequel covering the later chapters of Michael Jackson's life was already in development, with director Antoine Fuqua indicating that sufficient additional footage and material existed to support a continuation. The announced sequel will presumably address the period the first film deliberately avoided, the controversies, the legal proceedings, the final years, and the complicated legacy that the first film's critical detractors argued required honest engagement to make any genuine biographical claim. Whether a sequel covering that material can replicate the commercial success of the first film is genuinely uncertain. Part of the first film's audience was drawn by the music and the visual pleasure of watching a familiar cultural figure brought back to life on screen. A second film that engages directly with the more difficult chapters of the same life will ask something different from that audience, and how they respond is not predictable from the first film's numbers alone. For Jaafar, the trajectory of the past 3 years represents one of the stranger and more instructive stories in recent entertainment history. An actor with no film credits, no formal training at the start of the process, and a surname that guaranteed every imperfection would be held to the highest possible standard, delivered a debut performance in the highest-grossing biopic ever made. Whether that outcome resulted from genuine talent, an extraordinary commitment to preparation, circumstances that positioned him uniquely for this specific role, or some combination of all three, is a question that people will likely argue about for years. What is harder to argue with is the observable record of what he did. He could have released the same modest music in the same modest venues indefinitely, trading on the family name for a certain level of comfortable obscurity. Instead, he accepted the most public possible risk, spent 2 years rebuilding himself as a performer, and emerged from the process with something he had not entered it with, a career in film that appears to have a genuine future. That outcome raises a question worth closing on. History has a way of eventually deciding whether a performance was genuinely good or simply a product of circumstances that temporarily looked like genius. Which category do you think Jaafar's performance ultimately belongs in? And does it matter to your answer that he had never acted before in his life? Leave your perspective below. The conversation about what this performance represents is far from finished, and your take on it is part of how that conversation develops.